Good evening. Bob Phillips was a legend in our community. He was a most recognizable voice and face of Channel 12 for 33 years. He began his lengthy career in 1966, and for the next 16 years anchored the evening news broadcast. From there he moved to the morning news, anchoring the news desk till 1999. Born in Poplar Bluff, Missouri in 1931, Bob had a multifaceted career prior to moving to Joplin. His true passion was creating mini documentaries, which became known as the Phillips File. Showcasing his outstanding range as a researcher, writer, and commentator, these nearly 500 news stories enlighten the television audience about a colorful range of topics from Thomas Hart Benton to Ozark folk music. Bob received numerous awards and commendations for his outstanding body of work, and rightly so. It's an honor and privilege to assist him tonight with a series of stories he wrote and produced dealing with outlaws in the region. I thank Darren McCann and KODE General Manager John Hoffman for involving me in this project. Some time ago, Bob produced a 5-part series titled The Bad Men of Joplin. As Bob firmly puts it, every well-known outlaw worth being called an outlaw either stopped in Joplin or cooled off in our city. Bob does not miss a beat as he speaks of Jesse James making stops in Joplin, Ma Barker's connection to Webb City, Pretty Boy Floyd staying a night at the Connor Hotel, and area resident Herb Farmer assisting with the plans of the massacre at Kansas City Union Station. I will be back following the conclusion of these segments and share some of my thoughts, as well as add a little more to Bob's work.
I'm Bob Phillips. Because of the geographical location near the state lines of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, the city of Joplin, Missouri has always been a destination for outlaws, a place they could go to escape detection by the authorities. Nearly every notorious desperado from the late 1800s to the early 1900s used Joplin as a cooling-off place. A few years ago, we put together a 5-part television feature on those bad old days and looked at some of these characters that Joplin could just as well have done without. In this rogues gallery, we found the likes of Belle Starr, Cole Younger, Ma Barker and her Viper's Brood, Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie and Clyde, and the most famous of them all, Jesse James. Here then is our report on that era, which we call The Bad Men of Joplin.
By the turn of the century, Missouri had produced more outlaws than any other state. She was called the Mother of Bandits. In southwest Missouri, conveniently located near the state lines of Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, the bustling community of Joplin was a natural destination for desperados. A lead and zinc mining center since the late 1840s, it was a wide-open boom town. As the years passed, nearly every notorious American outlaw used Joplin as a way station. Among the first was the most famous of them all, Jesse Woodson James. Born in Kearney, Missouri in 1847, Jesse, his brother Frank, and their gang robbed banks and railroads all over the Midwest and made several stops in Joplin. Old-timers told of an occasion when Jesse got a shave and haircut at a Main Street barber shop. He also reportedly had a shootout with 5 deputies just outside town. Another visitor during those hell-raising mining days was Missourian Cole Younger, who, along with his brothers, joined Jesse in many a robbery. Henry Starr, a half-Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, also graced Joplin with his presence. Henry was one of the earliest bank robbers. He held up 48 banks during his career, a total never equaled. He was the first bandit to use an automobile for his getaway. Then there was Myra Maybelle Shirley, born near Carthage in 1848, who went on to become Belle Starr, the outlaw queen of Indian Territory. She was in and out of Joplin frequently. Over a period of time, Joplin became a favorite cooling-off spot for outlaws where they could rest and relax without being hassled by the law. How did the city earn this dubious honor? Vernon Sigers, a Joplin Justice of the Peace from 1934 to 1941, remembers.
I think the main reason was that we're in the corner of the state here where they could easily step across the state line and be out of jurisdiction of the officers who were pursuing them or were trying to investigate them. Joplin was known the world over as a wide open town. It had gambling people in it. It had the sort of people that would, maybe if they didn't actually associate with these outlaws, they put up with them to some extent.
Time finally ran out on Jesse, Cole, Bell, and Henry. Jesse was killed by assassin Bob Ford in St. Joe in 1882. Bell was shot in the back by a neighbor in 1889. Cole died of natural causes in Kansas City in 1916, and Henry was gunned down robbing an Arkansas bank in 1921. But more outlaws were waiting in the wings to visit Joplin. In the next part of our report, we'll meet two more guests, a little old lady called Ma Barker and a good-natured bumbler named George Machine Gun Kelly. By the 1920s, Joplin had already seen its share of outlaws, but more were on the way. Bootleggers, thieves, bank robbers, and murderers continued to use Joplin as a port of call. Among them, Arizona Donnie Clark, born near Springfield in 1872. An ill-tempered religious woman, she cherished her Ozark heritage. In 1892, Kate, as she was then called, married George Barker, a common laborer, and settled down in Aurora. They had 4 children, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Freddie. Ma eventually moved the family to Webb City, where Pa Barker got a job in the mines, and the 4 boys turned to petty crime. Ma claimed the Joplin and Webb City police were picking on her sons and decided to move the family to Tulsa. In Tulsa, Ma ran a safe house for other criminals and began to help her boys plan robberies, kidnappings, and murders. Son Freddie and a prison buddy of his named Alvin Creepy Carpus liked to visit Joplin in their pursuit of bootleg liquor and women.
Whiskey sold here for $2 a pint. You could buy half a pint. Jay Wilder, that had the drugstore down at 3rd and Main Street, furnished them well. They got the little half pint bottles for them.
The red light district, you might say the center of it, was right about where the City Hall is today, and all around there, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, from 1st Street to about 6th Street, where that was a red light district.
Williams Timber Hill Cemetery, just outside Welch, Oklahoma, is the final resting place of an infamous criminal family, Kate Ma Barker and her sons. Recently, caretaker Preston Curry showed us their lonely graves. In the 1920s and 30s, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Fred Barker, with their mother's aid and support, robbed banks, kidnapped, and murdered with little hesitation. All of them but one died violently, and 5 of them are buried here. Being outlaws, they weren't wanted at first, but the cemetery board finally gave permission, provided the Barker plot was isolated from other graves. The first to die was Herman, the oldest son, wounded in a police shootout after a Kansas robbery in 1927. Herman killed himself. 8 years later, Ma and her youngest son Fred were killed in a blazing gun battle with FBI agents in Florida. Arthur, or Doc, was sentenced to life in Alcatraz for kidnapping and was killed in 1939 while trying to escape. George, or Pa Barker, the honest, hard-working father who turned from his wife and sons when they became criminals, lived out his days in the Webb City, Missouri area and died in 1941. Lloyd, the least-known son, served 25 years for robbery. Paroled in 1947, he was shot to death by his wife 2 years later and is buried in Colorado. The Great Depression did indeed produce many notorious outlaws, but none had more impact on society than Ma and her boys. They wrote one of the bloodiest chapters in the history of crime. While Ma and her brood were in their heyday, along came good old George Kelly. A Memphis bootlegger, Kelly's later bad man image was invented by his wife, Catherine, who assured her underworld buddies that George was really a mean criminal and an expert with a machine gun. Truth was, old George never hurt a soul, and never would. To the end, he was more clown than criminal. In July of 1933, egged on by Catherine, he and an accomplice kidnapped wealthy Oklahoma City oil man Charles Urschel. Kelly mailed the ransom note to the Urschel family from Joplin. The ransom was paid and Urschel was released. As a parting gift, Kelly gave the oil man a Panama hat to keep his head warm. On the hatband were the words, "Newman's, Joplin's greatest store." The end of the Barker and Kelly eras can be told quickly. All four of Ma's sons died by violence, with Ma being killed next to Freddie in an FBI shootout in Florida in 1935. Kelly was apprehended, convicted of the Urschel kidnapping, and died in Leavenworth Prison in 1954. Also on Joplin's guest list were two diminutive Texans and a chubby Oklahoma farm boy. In Part 3 of our report, a look back at Bonnie and Clyde and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd. By the early 1930s, Joplin had become a haven for outlaws, including two young Texans named Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Clyde had been in and out of trouble with the law since he was 9. Bonnie, a tiny blonde, was a waitress with a husband when she met Clyde. They teamed up in 1932 to rob banks, grocery stores, and small businesses, and ended up killing about a dozen people, most of them law officers. After robbing a loan office in Kansas City in 1933, they headed to Joplin to cool off. Bonnie and Clyde, Clyde's brother Buck and his wife Blanche, and an itinerant hoodlum named W.D. Jones holed up in this garage apartment in Joplin's Freeman Grove addition. Suspecting the tenants of the apartment were bootleggers, 2 carloads of lawmen drove up here on the afternoon of April 13th, 1933. And what followed has been called the Battle of Joplin. In a wild shootout, the Barrow gang killed a Joplin detective and a Newton County constable. Don Walker was a crime reporter for the Joplin Globe in the 1930s. He remembers what happened that day.
They got their weapons, and when the officers approached the apartment, they opened the door and start firing. Of course, it's Wes Harriman. The constable was fatally wounded, and my friend McGinnis, one arm was blasted off, and he later died. And there was just confusion everywhere. Then they got in their souped-up car and took off.
Charles Arthur Floyd of Aikens, Oklahoma, nicknamed Pretty Boy by a brothel madam, made his reputation as a bank robber and killed at least 10 people along the way. A native of the Cookson Hills, he was the hero of the dirt-poor farmers in that area because he robbed banks. And during the Depression, nearly everyone hated banks and bankers. The hill folk hid Floyd and protected him from the law. He visited Joplin occasionally, staying once at the famous old Connor Hotel at 4th and Main. Nobody bothered him. Pretty Boy's string ran out in Ohio in 1934, when he was hunted down and shot to death by FBI agents far from his beloved Oklahoma. As for Bonnie and Clyde, lawmen cornered them in their car in Louisiana a year after the Joplin battle and cut them down with machine guns and rifles. At the time of their death, Clyde was 25, Bonnie was 23. In Part 4 of our report, we'll go behind the scenes of the Kansas City Union Station massacre and recall a bank robber from Joplin named Wilbur Underhill. The Kansas City Union Station massacre of June 17, 1933, was one of the most shocking crimes of this century. It occurred because of this man, Frank Nash, a notorious bank robber and hoodlum. On June 16th, Nash was captured in Hot Springs, Arkansas by FBI agents who intended to return him to Leavenworth Federal Prison, from where he had escaped 3 years earlier. As the agents were putting Nash on a train for the trip back to Kansas, Nash's wife, Frances, alerted the underworld. One of those contacted was Herb Farmer in Joplin, an old friend of Nash who owned a chicken ranch south of the city. Farmer helped organize the machinery to free Nash from the lawmen when the train pulled into Kansas City's Union Station the next morning. Frances Nash chartered a private plane and flew from Hot Springs to Joplin to meet Farmer and await developments. Kansas City hoodlum Vern Miller was to handle things at his end. He did. He and 2 accomplices were waiting at the station, and when Nash was transferred to a waiting car for the ride to Leavenworth, the 3 gangsters opened fire with machine guns, killing 4 law officers and, apparently by accident, Nash himself. Witnesses said later that Pretty Boy Floyd was one of the assassins, but to his dying day, Floyd denied any involvement. Herb Farmer of Joplin was subsequently convicted of conspiracy in connection with the massacre and sentenced to 2 years in Alcatraz.
He was nothing but a petty larceny thief, Wilbur Underhill was. Actually, a petty larceny thief.
Well-known Joplin resident J.L. Bones Treadway recalls another criminal figure from the early 30s, a Joplin native named Wilbur Underhill.
He put a little old .32 pistol in my back, and when he said, Bones, he said, put your hands up. Well, the minute he said that, I knew who it was. I said, oh, hell, Wilbur. I said, put the damn pistol down before I ram it up. And I said, Wilbur, I said, why don't you, if you're going to do this, I said, you're finally going to get killed or you're going to get in the penitentiary for life. I said, why don't you, if you're going to rob anyone, rob a bank where you just have to do it one time.
During his career, Wilbur robbed dozens of banks in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas. He became known as the Tri-State Terror. While on his honeymoon in Shawnee, Oklahoma, on New Year's Day in 1934, lawmen shot him to death during a blazing gun battle. The infamous outlaw days around Joplin were now coming to a close. In the final part of our report, we'll focus on Joplin's most hideous crime and on a retired bank robber named John Harvey Bailey. By the late 1930s, Joplin was coming of age and trying to play down its high-living, hell-raising past. Most of the big-time criminals were gone now, either in prison or dead. But in late 1950, Joplin and the entire nation was shocked by a crime of barbaric proportions. The perpetrator was William Cook, born Joplin, 1929. In a one-man crime wave that terrorized the Southwest, Billy Cook kidnapped 12 people and murdered 6 of them in cold blood. Illinois farmer Carl Mosser, on a pleasure trip with his wife and 3 children, ran into Billy near Claremore, Oklahoma. After forcing Mosser to drive him back to Joplin, Cook killed the entire family and threw their bodies down an abandoned mine shaft in the northwest part of the city. 10 days later, the bodies were discovered by Joplin Chief of Detectives Carl Nutt.
Carl Mosser was a man about my size. He'd been shot twice in the chest, once in the butt of the ear, and it came out right over his temple. And his little son, 7 years old, was done shot the same way. It's not a joy to find anything like that, Bob. You know that. You just have to put yourself in my place. I had a job to do, and I tried the best to do it I knew how. And I'm thankful that we did find him. I was told later by some authorities that another 3 days they'd never been found. They had to begin to deteriorate when we found them.
Billy was caught in Mexico after killing another man from Seattle, was tried and convicted of murder, and executed at San Quentin Prison on December 12, 1952. Bad Man Billy, as he was called, was buried in an unmarked grave by the light of lanterns and flashlights on the night of December 16th, here in Peace Cemetery, north of the city he called home. Another well-known desperado would spend his final days in Joplin. John Harvey Bailey was the king of the bank robbers, the best there was. In 1922, he robbed the U.S. Mint in Denver of over $500,000, and in 1931 hit a Nebraska bank for over $1 million, the largest robbery on record up to that time. This gentleman bandit, who knew and worked with the biggest names in crime, was in and out of prison over the years and served his last stretch for a kidnapping he didn't commit. Paroled from Leavenworth in 1962, he moved to Joplin and took a job as a cabinet maker. He died in Joplin in 1979 at the age of 91 and is buried in Forest Park Cemetery. On this rather quiet note, Joplin's bad old days passed into history. At one time or another, this city played host to most of the Midwest bad men. But Joplin has grown up now, and the outlaws of old have departed. Let us fervently hope we never see their like again. Bob Phillips, News Site 12.
The photographs used in Part 3 covering the Bonnie and Clyde shootout were discovered at the 34th Street apartment. Immediately following the gun battle, authorities recovered the film that was left at the site. Those images were extremely valuable in aiding the law enforcement community, as they did not know the identities of the gang participating on that fateful day on April 13, 1933. Some additional information on Herbert Farmer. He lived south of Joplin on a 23-acre farm. Besides being an ex-con, Farmer used his home as a shelter for criminals. He also operated one of the most efficient underworld post offices in America, handling mail from some of our country's most infamous as well as wanted outlaws. Bob also states that Billy Cook and John Harvey Bailey were buried in the vicinity. Cook in an unmarked grave at Peace Cemetery and Bailey in a marked grave at Forest Park Cemetery. Two other outlaws are also resting in Joplin soil. Their names are Harry and Jennings Young. They reside together at Fairview Cemetery. Another story that has Joplin connection occurred on January 2, 1932, when a police posse traveled to a farmhouse near Brookline, Missouri. During that afternoon, 6 law enforcement officers surrounded the home of James and Florence Young. James and Florence had 11 children. Most of them became good, law-abiding citizens. However, 2 of their sons, Harry and Jennings Young, became 2 of the most wanted murderers in the history of the United States at the time. When the officers surrounded the Young house, Harry and Jennings Young were there, waiting. Itching for a gunfight, the Young brothers opened fire on the police officers as they moved closer to the house. Unfortunately, the policemen were no match for these 2 expert sharpshooters, as they successfully picked off 1 lawman, one after another. These dedicated policemen refused to give ground or even turn away. They paid dearly for their actions. Harry and Jennings Young killed 6 men. Marcel Hendricks, Sheriff of Greene County. Wiley Mashburn, Deputy Sheriff. Ollie Crosswhite, Deputy Sheriff. Tony Oliver, Chief of Springfield's Detective Bureau. Sid Meadows, Detective, and Charles Hauser, Patrol Driver. Hauser had ties to Joplin. He was born in Joplin and attended Joplin Public Schools. Immediately following this horrendous nightmare, Harry and Jennings Young fled. The outraged law enforcement community quickly mobilized, becoming one of the largest manhunts at the time as they pursued these ruthless killers. Police authorities found the brothers in Houston, Texas. This time, the shootout was quite different, as both young brothers were found dead at the end of the day. W.L. Starn, a Springfield mortician, was sent to retrieve and identify the bodies of the 2 men. Starnes had direct and emphatic orders that these 2 cold-blooded killers would never reach Greene County, let alone be buried there. The community was scarred. 6 families were grieving, and a violent retaliation seemed possible. Instead, their final resting place would be Joplin, Missouri, at Fairview Cemetery. Both bodies were lowered into the ground at 10:30 a.m. on January 13, 1932. Because of the sensational nature of their actions, the Joplin police force posted someone at the site to protect the grave of Harry and Jenny Young. A couple of days earlier in Springfield, at police officer Charles Hauser's funeral service, several Joplin law enforcement officers paid their respect by attending the ceremony. Joplin detectives Thomas DeGraff and Harry McGinnis were in attendance. And how ironic was that? In 14 months, both DeGraff and McGinnis would be at the site of the Bonnie and Clyde shootout. Joplin detective Harry McGinnis would pay the ultimate sacrifice by losing his life, as noted earlier by Bob Phillips and Don Walker. As for Joplin detective Thomas DeGraff, he should have been the poster boy for good luck. During an 11-year period, DeGraff was involved in 3 gunfights and amazingly survived them all. His first shootout occurred in 1924 with Roy Doherty. Roy Doherty was an extremely dangerous convicted felon, bank robber, and had allegedly killed 18 men. He received his just reward as he died in a gunfight at a Joplin residence at 1420 West 9th Street. As stated earlier, DeGraff was in the Bonnie and Clyde gun battle. During the violent encounter, DeGraff fired 4 shots, but remained unscathed for a second time. On June 22, 1935, DeGraff and robbery suspect Glenn Dixon pointed their guns and fired at each other in a dark alley. Both hit their mark. Dixon was shot in the abdomen, and DeGraff was hit in the forehead above the right eye. Dixon was rushed to St. John's Hospital. After a few hours, he was pronounced dead. DeGraff miraculously survived and lived with the bullet lodged in his brain for the rest of his life. The historical arc and the tie of outlaws to the region has been accentuated by Bob Phillips. It's been a pleasure to assist Bob and work with the talented folks of Channel 12. And to coin a phrase from Bob, thanks for watching.